Hey, my name is Wesley Hart. I'm 33 years old, and I spend most of my life reinforcing buildings that are one bad storm away from collapsing, which people tell me is a strange career for a man who once left his own hometown without saying a single true thing he meant to say. 3 days ago, I drove back into Millbrook Falls for a 15-year reunion I had told everyone, myself included, that I wasn't attending. I was standing in the same gym where I used to run suicide drills for a coach who's probably retired by now, holding a paper cup of punch I had no plans of drinking, when the door at the far end swung open and June Marsh walked back into my life with a little girl's hand wrapped tight around hers. The room did that thing rooms do when everyone recognizes someone at once and nobody wants to be the first to react out loud. Conversations kept moving. Eyes didn't. Somebody near the drinks table murmured a sentence with the words Daniel and terrible in it, pitched low enough that I wasn't supposed to catch the rest, and I didn't. Not yet, not the whole story. June didn't look at any of them. She scanned the gym the way you check exits in a room you've already decided isn't safe, and then her eyes found mine and stopped moving. 3 seconds. Maybe 4, long enough that I noticed my own pulse. Somebody had strung up the same faded crepe paper we'd had at prom, and a playlist of songs from our senior year was looping through a speaker somebody had propped on the free throw line, and none of it registered as anything but background noise. My whole focus had narrowed down to 20 feet of gym floor, and the woman standing at the end of it, like the 15 years between us had just gone quiet, not disappeared. Then the little girl let go of her hand and started walking. She couldn't have been more than 6, in rubber boots that looked like they'd seen actual mud that day, not just decoration. She crossed that gym floor like she'd rehearsed the route, past a table of name tags nobody had bothered to alphabetize, past 2 of my old teammates who went quiet mid-sentence to watch her go, and she stopped about 2 feet in front of me, with her chin tipped all the way back, so she could see my whole face. She had a gap where a front tooth used to be, and the kind of total seriousness little kids get when they think they're doing something important. I crouched down without deciding to. She looked at me for a second like she was checking my face against a picture she already had memorized, and then she said it. "Mommy said you'd come." "Come where?" I finally managed to ask, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "Here," like the answer should have been obvious. "To the dance. Mommy said the boy from her story might be here tonight, and I found you, so I win." She said this last part with the flat satisfaction of someone who considered the matter closed. I didn't have an answer for that either. I'm not sure I had anything in me yet that qualified as an answer. Behind her, June had gone the color of the cup in my hand, and she crossed the distance between us in about 4 fast steps, already apologizing before she'd fully arrived. "I'm so sorry." She talks to everyone. She doesn't, and then she stopped herself and just reached for the girl's hand instead of finishing the sentence. "Ren, honey, we talked about this." Ren didn't argue. She let herself be turned toward the door, but she looked back at me once over her shoulder, quick, like she was confirming something she'd already decided was true, and then the 2 of them were gone through the far doors, and the gym noise rushed back in to fill the space where they'd been standing. June didn't look back once. I stood there holding a cup of warm punch, trying to work out what had just happened to me, and coming up short. Teddy Okafor found me about 90 seconds later, the way Teddy always finds you, right when you'd rather be alone with your own thoughts for a while longer. He'd gone soft around the middle and gray at the temples since the last time I'd seen him, but he still had the exact laugh that used to get both of us sent to the office. He followed where I was still staring, toward the doors, and let out a low whistle. "You didn't hear," he said. "Didn't hear what?" Daniel Marsh, man. He died about 1.5 years ago. Ice storm out past the Orchard Road. Car went into the ditch on a curve everybody in this town has slid on at least once, and that was it. Something dropped through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I hadn't heard any of it. I'd spent most of that year on a job outside Tulsa, sleeping in a construction trailer, checking my phone maybe once a week if the site had signal at all. Teddy kept talking, filling in pieces I only half caught, but one detail landed and stayed put. "Ren's his kid," he said. "Theirs. She's 6 now, I think. Sweet as anything, whole towns watched June try to hold that orchard together on her own since it happened. And from what I hear, it hasn't exactly been easy." I didn't tell Teddy that 15 years ago, the night before I left for basic training, June Calder and I sat on the tailgate of my truck behind this exact building, and I had every intention of telling her I loved her. I'd built the sentence in my head that whole week, practiced it in the shower that morning like an idiot, out loud, quiet enough that my mother wouldn't hear through the wall. And when the actual moment arrived, when she looked over at me with the gym's porch light behind her and asked what I was thinking so hard about, I said, "I'll call you instead," which is what a coward says when the real sentence is too heavy to lift. I didn't call, not that week, not that month. By the time I found the nerve, enough silence had already gone by that a phone call felt like it would need an apology stitched to the front of it that I didn't know how to write, so I let it go quiet instead and told myself that was the kinder option for both of us. It wasn't. I understood that fully for the first time standing in a gymnasium 15 years later, watching a 6-year-old with her mother's exact chin tell a room full of strangers that her mother had been talking about me. I set my cup down on the nearest folding table and went after her. Teddy said something behind me I didn't catch and didn't turn around for. I found June in the parking lot, keys already out, wrestling a car seat buckle with the specific fury of someone who needs her hands busy so the rest of her doesn't have to be. Ren was already half asleep against the window, worn out from being the most honest person in the building. "June," I said. She didn't turn right away. When she finally did, she had her apology face back on, the same one from the gym, and I realized I'd probably seen that exact expression on her before, a long time ago, right around when I'd broken her heart in the gentlest, most cowardly way a person can manage it. "I'm sorry about Ren. She's been asking about you for years, and I genuinely never thought you'd walk through that door, so I never prepped her for what to do if you actually did." I told her it was fine. I meant it. She studied me for a second like she was deciding whether to believe that, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "About me?" She looked past me at the gym doors, lit up gold against the dark lot, and let out a breath with a laugh caught somewhere inside it that didn't quite make it all the way out. "There's a story I used to tell her, about a boy who climbed the water tower on a dare and got his name on the town website for 3 days because nobody could figure out how he'd gotten down without a ladder. I told her he was somebody I used to know. I left out the part where he left town 2 weeks later and never called. Kids don't need the second half of stories. I remembered that water tower. I remembered exactly how much trouble I'd been in for it, and how June had been the only person who thought it was funny instead of reckless. I asked if I could walk her the rest of the way to her car, mostly because I wasn't ready for the conversation to end yet. "Okay," she managed, in a voice that told me she wasn't ready either, even if she'd never have admitted it out loud. We made it about halfway across the lot when headlights swung in fast off the main road, too fast for 10 at night in an empty parking lot, and stopped at an angle that boxed June's car in against the curb. A woman got out before the engine had finished ticking down. I didn't know her yet, but I knew the type on sight, the kind of person who walks like she's already won an argument she hasn't started. "We need to talk about Friday." The woman didn't so much as glance at me. June's whole posture shifted, straight and careful, the way you brace for a wave you've already been hit by once before. "It's 10 o'clock, Constance," she said. "My lawyer sent your lawyer everything this afternoon. There's nothing left to discuss tonight." Constance Marsh looked at June the way you'd look at a stain you were deciding whether was worth the effort of scrubbing out. And then, finally, her eyes moved to me. "And who is this?" A friend of June's, I said, before June could answer for me, mostly because I didn't care for how the question had been asked. Constance's eyebrows rose a fraction, filing that information away for later, and I had the distinct sense I'd just become a data point in a case I didn't understand yet. Friday, 10 a.m., Courthouse Annex. Still addressing June, not me. Bring the financials this time, all of them, not the version your lawyers decided looks good. Then she was back in her car and gone, taillights cutting hard around the corner, and June stood there with her keys biting into her palm from how tight she was gripping them. I didn't ask, I just waited, because some things you learn not to push on right away. After a minute, she leaned back against her car and told me anyway, in the flat, over-rehearsed voice of somebody who's explained this too many times to too many people who didn't actually help. Daniel's father set up a family trust 30 years ago that owns the orchard land outright. The house and the cider business are mine, clean, no argument there. But the land underneath all of it belongs to the trust, and Constance is the surviving co-trustee, which means every major decision about that property needs her signature. Since Daniel died, she's decided I can't run the place without him, and she's petitioning the court for partial guardianship of Wren on the grounds that I'm, quote, financially unstable and maintaining an unsafe environment, and if that goes through, the trust reverts to her sole discretion, and I don't have to draw you a picture of what happens to the orchard after that. I asked what unsafe environment meant, specifically. The cider barn. Structural concerns, she said, doing air quotes with fingers that were shaking slightly. Constance says it's a hazard for a 6-year-old to be anywhere near. I've had 3 separate contractors out there. Nobody's found a thing. Something in the back of my head, the part of me that gets paid to notice when a building is lying about how sound it actually is, filed that detail away and didn't let go of it. I ended up driving them both home, since June's hands were still shaking too much for her to want to trust them with a car full of sleeping kid, and I followed her directions out past the edge of town to a gravel road lined with trees, just starting to go heavy with unripe fruit. She carried Wren inside without waking her, moving like someone who'd done it 1,000 times, careful and completely unglamorous about it, and when she came back out to walk me to my truck, she stood there a second, with her arms crossed against the night air, like she was deciding whether to say something else. "Thank you for staying tonight," she said finally, "for not being weird about the whole gymnasium thing." I told her I was planning on being at least a little weird about the whole gymnasium thing eventually, just not necessarily tonight, and that got the first real laugh out of her I'd heard since she'd walked back into my life a few hours earlier. It was a good sound. I'd forgotten how much I used to like causing it. I told my mother I was staying in town an extra week to spend time with her, which was true, technically, the way a lot of things I say are true technically. What was also true was that by Wednesday morning I had directions to Marsh Orchard programmed into my truck before I'd fully admitted to myself I was going to use them. Tuesday was quieter on the surface. June called that evening, ostensibly to apologize again for Wren, and I told her there was nothing left to apologize for, and neither of us hung up. We ended up talking for 40 minutes about nothing that mattered, in the specific way you can only manage with someone whose voice already knows the shape of your silences. She told me the orchard had 140 trees, and that she still couldn't tell a Honeycrisp branch from a Gala one without checking the tags Daniel used to paint on them by hand. I told her about a bridge inspection I'd done outside Reno, where the whole structure had been sound except for one bolt, one that some contractor had swapped out for the wrong grade a decade earlier, and how something that small could sit there quietly failing for years before anyone noticed. She went quiet on the line for a second, and then said that sounded familiar somehow, and I didn't ask her to explain what she meant, because I had a feeling I already knew. Near the end of the call, she asked, carefully, like she was testing the weight of the question before fully committing to it, whether I was planning on sticking around town much longer. I told her I hadn't decided yet. That was true then. It got less true every day after. June didn't seem surprised when I actually showed up Wednesday. She handed me a coffee mug without asking if I wanted one and told me Wren was around back feeding a chicken named Detective, a sentence I did not request an explanation for. Wren found me before I found her. She was crouched by the coop in boots 2 sizes too big, and she looked up when my shadow crossed her and gave me the same courtroom seriousness from the gym. "You came back." It sounded like she was double-checking the results of an experiment she'd run. I told her I did. She considered that for a second, then asked if I wanted to help her name the new chicken. And for the next 20 minutes, I stood in a coop debating the relative merits of nugget versus waffles with a 6-year-old, which was, without exaggeration, the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in about a decade. At some point, out of nowhere, she asked if I'd loved her mom before her dad did. I didn't lie, and I didn't over-explain either. I told her yes, a long time ago, before either of us knew what to do with it. She nodded like the answer satisfied some internal ledger she'd been keeping, and went back to negotiating chicken names like nothing had happened at all. June found us there a few minutes later and, apparently satisfied that Waffles had been properly christened, walked me the rest of the way around the property herself, pointing out which rows Daniel had planted the year Wren was born, which ones his grandfather had put in decades before that. She talked about him easily, without the careful flatness people use when they're protecting themselves, telling me he used to hum off-key while pruning and swore the trees grew better for it, and that he'd once spent an entire weekend building Wren a treehouse he refused to let anyone help with, out of what June called pure stubborn pride, and what I recognized as something closer to love with its sleeves rolled up. I liked him from what she told me. That surprised me a little, how easy it was to like a dead man who'd married the woman I never called. She caught me looking at the treehouse a beat too long. He'd have liked you, probably, quiet enough that I almost missed it. Then, before I could figure out what to do with that sentence, she headed off toward the tasting room to open up for the afternoon, and told me to holler if I found anything wrong with her barn, in a tone that made it clear she expected me to find nothing. After that, I walked the property alone, because June had customers, and because I wanted to see the barn Constance was so sure was dangerous. It took about 4 minutes of actually looking at it, instead of just glancing at it, to know something was off. The main support beam on the north wall had rot creeping up from a water intrusion point that should have been caught and sealed years earlier. A cheap fix if you catch it early, a few $100s, maybe less. Somebody hadn't caught it early. I'd seen this exact pattern before, on a job outside Joplin, a grain elevator whose owner had let a small leak sit for 2 winters because fixing it meant admitting the bigger problem underneath, and by the time anyone called me in, it wasn't a few $100s anymore. I took photos anyway, methodically, the way I would for any site report, close on the rot line, wide on the whole beam, a shot of the water stain on the concrete footing that told its own quiet story about how long this had been going on. Old habits. I didn't know yet that I'd need them, but something told me to document it properly instead of just mentioning it over dinner. I found the maintenance log in a filing cabinet in the tasting room, wedged between cider recipes and a shoebox of Wren's old drawings, and it took maybe 10 minutes to find what I was looking for. 3 separate repair requests over 14 months, each one itemized, each one under the trust's own $5,000 threshold for co-trustee approval, and each one denied, in the same tight handwriting, with the same 2 initials at the bottom, CM. I brought the log inside and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything at first, because I wanted June to see it before I put words around it and changed how she read it. She went quiet reading it, quieter than I'd heard her all week, and then she picked up her phone and called someone named Priya, who turned out to be a lawyer and, from the first 10 seconds of that call, also a friend who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of break. Priya arrived within the hour, sharp in the particular way people get when they've had to be sharp on someone else's behalf for a long time. She read through the denied requests twice before saying a word. "This isn't just useful. This is the whole case. Constance is arguing the barn's unsafe because June's negligent. This proves the barn's unsafe because Constance refused to sign the checks. That's not negligence. That's sabotage with a paper trail attached to it." June sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, like her legs had been waiting for permission to stop holding her up. For a second, nobody said anything. Then she looked at me and said, quietly, "You weren't even supposed to be here for this." I wasn't sure if that was a complaint, so I chose not to answer it like one. I told her I was glad I was, and I meant it more than the sentence let on. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind where you can watch somebody deciding exactly how much truth is safe to spend. I don't have room left to lose someone else. Not the way I'd have to lose them if I let myself actually feel anything here, she admitted. I understood exactly what she meant, and I didn't have a clever answer for it, so I didn't reach for one. That night, back at my mother's house, I had an email sitting in my inbox from my supervisor, a new assignment out past Bakersfield, a retaining wall system that had already failed twice and needed somebody who didn't need 3 weeks to get up to speed. She wanted an answer by Friday morning. I read it twice and didn't reply, and I noticed, in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar, that some part of me was already drafting the version of myself who'd take it and be on a plane by Sunday. The same part of me that once said, "I'll call you," instead of the truth, and considered that a plan. I almost hated how easy it still was to picture. Thursday came fast. It started with an email from Priya, forwarding an amended filing Constance's lawyer had submitted overnight. Somewhere in the legal language, buried in paragraph 4, was a line about June exposing Wren to, and I'm quoting the actual document here, "an unstable and transient male influence with no established ties to the child," which took me a full minute to realize was about me. Priya called it a scare tactic, the legal equivalent of throwing a chair to see who flinches, but June didn't look like someone unbothered by chairs being thrown. She read it twice at the kitchen table, jaw tight, and said she was sorry I'd been dragged into it by name. I told her I didn't scare that easily, and that I'd been called worse things by people whose opinion mattered a great deal more to me than Constance Marsh's. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Priya thought a private conversation before the hearing might still resolve things faster and cleaner than a courtroom would. And June, when it came down to it, didn't actually want to win this in a way that humiliated Wren's only living grandmother in public, whatever else was now true between them. There was a rough hour before we left for Constance's house, where June nearly talked herself out of going at all, standing in the kitchen with the maintenance log in her hands, saying maybe it was better to just let the lawyers handle it from a distance, safer, cleaner, less to lose if it went wrong. I didn't push. I just said that Wren had asked me, that afternoon, whether grown-ups ever got brave on purpose, and that I'd told her sometimes, and that I'd like it if June proved me right. She looked at the log a while longer, then grabbed her keys. Constance answered her own door, already dressed for an argument, sharp and unsurprised, like she'd been expecting this for days. She let us in anyway. Priya laid the maintenance log on the coffee table without much ceremony, and let Constance read it herself instead of narrating it for her, which struck me as the smarter move, because I watched something shift in her face as she went down that list of dates and denials in her own handwriting. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did anyone else. The house had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has actual weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing on your ears. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the edge it carried in the parking lot. "I kept telling myself the trust needed to stay solvent," she said, "mostly to the folder, not really to any of us. That if I held the line on spending, there'd be something left for Ren when she's older, something Daniel would have wanted protected. I told myself June wasn't being careful enough, and that if I just held on tighter, I could keep one more piece of my son from disappearing. Her hands stayed flat on the table, very still. I didn't say I wasn't the one making that barn dangerous. That's a hard thing to hear about yourself in a room full of people. For a moment I thought she might dig in anyway, the way people sometimes do exactly because they've been caught, doubling down instead of backing off. Something sharper flickered back into her face as she looked up at June. Even if I made a mistake about the barn, that doesn't mean you're equipped to raise her alone out here. I've watched you struggle. I've watched the accounts. Priya opened her mouth to respond, but June got there first, her voice steadier than I'd heard it all week. I have struggled. I've struggled every single day for 1.5 years, and I'm still here, and Ren is still fed and loved and asking about chickens instead of asking why nobody will let her be a kid. Struggling isn't the same thing as failing, Constance. My guess is you'd know that if you let yourself remember the years right after your husband died. June didn't gloat after that, and she didn't soften it either. Ren asks about her dad every single day, Constance, she said quietly. She could ask about her grandmother too, if her grandmother let her. Something in Constance's face came apart for a second, fast, before she put it back together. Right about then, Ren, who was supposed to be asleep in the car, appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair sticking up on one side, and asked if she could show Grandma Constance the chicken she'd finally named. Waffles won, apparently, by a landslide. Constance looked at her for a long moment, and something in her whole posture let go all at once. Fine. Her voice wasn't quite steady anymore. Show me the chicken. I'll withdraw the petition tomorrow morning, before the hearing. Both of them. We drove back to the orchard a little after 10, Ren asleep again before we'd even hit the county road, worn out from being proven right about a chicken. June put her to bed and came back out to the porch, where I was still sitting because I didn't have anywhere else I needed to be yet. For a while neither of us said anything. The orchard at night has its own particular sound, wind moving through rows of trees close enough together to argue with each other, and we just sat inside that sound for a while. I have until tomorrow morning to tell my supervisor if I'm taking a job 2,000 miles from here, I said, mostly to the porch railing. She didn't answer right away, which told me more than a question would have. 15 years ago, the night before I left for basic training, I sat on my truck's tailgate behind the gym with you, and I had the whole sentence built. I love you, wait for me, something. I had it ready to go, and when the actual moment came, I said I'll call you instead, because that felt like it cost less up front. I never called, not because I stopped feeling it, because I was a coward about a 19-year-old's version of forever, and I let the silence do the breaking up so I wouldn't have to do it myself. She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone very soft, the kind of soft that only shows up once somebody's decided not to protect themselves anymore. I waited 4 months for that call. I used to check the machine before I even took my coat off. Then I stopped checking and told myself that was healthier, and mostly it was. I loved Daniel. I want to say that clearly because it's true, and it doesn't get smaller just because I'm about to say the next part out loud. I loved Daniel completely, and separately. There was a door I never all the way closed, and it didn't take one single thing away from him that it was there. It just meant some part of me kept telling our daughter stories about a boy who climbed a water tower for 6 years without really letting myself ask why. She didn't say anything else after that, neither did I. We just sat there with the orchard breathing around us, and at some point her hand found mine on the porch boards between us, and neither of us moved to pull away. I called my supervisor the next morning, before the hearing that ended up never happening. I told her to hand Bakersfield to Alvarez, who'd been ready for lead on something like that for 2 years anyway, and that I wanted to talk about the regional post out of the Portland office instead. 4 hours from Millbrook Falls instead of 4 states. She wasn't thrilled about it at first. She got over it by lunch. Constance withdrew both petitions in writing before 9 that morning, and the courthouse annex saw exactly none of us that Friday, which Priya said was probably the best possible outcome for any case, the one where nobody has to sit through it at all. That Saturday I sat down with Ren on the porch steps and told her, since it seemed like the kind of thing she deserved to hear directly and not overhear through a door, that I wasn't taking the job out west and that I was going to be around a lot more than I used to be. She considered this with her usual gravity, then asked if that meant I'd be at her chicken's next birthday, which I hadn't realized chickens had birthdays, but agreed to immediately and without conditions. Then she asked, quieter, if I was going to leave again like before. I told her the truth, that I used to be the kind of person who did that, but that I didn't want to be that person anymore, and that wanting it wasn't the same as promising it, but that I was going to work at it every single day if she'd let me. She thought about that for a long moment, the way she thinks about everything, and then held out her hand for me to shake on it. Formal as a business deal, and I shook it. June was watching us from the kitchen window the whole time, arms crossed, not even pretending not to listen. And when I came back inside, she didn't say anything, just handed me a cup of coffee and let her hand rest against mine a half-second longer than the handoff required. The town had its own way of moving on, too. The reunion committee ended up using a photo from that night in the class group online, somebody else's shot of the gym that happened to catch Ren mid-stride crossing the floor toward me. And the caption somebody wrote under it, half joking, said something about Millbrook Falls raising main characters. I didn't love the attention. June thought it was hilarious. 6 months after that, the cider barn had a new north wall, built mostly by me on weekends, with Ren handing me the wrong-sized wrench on purpose because she'd decided it was funny. Which, fair, it kind of was. Constance came out most Sundays by then. She wasn't a different person, not entirely, still sharp-edged in the particular way people get after decades of holding a business together through sheer will. But she'd started bringing Ren books that used to be Daniel's as a kid, and she'd started asking June actual questions instead of handing down verdicts, and some Sundays that turned out to be enough. I'd moved into the converted loft above the tasting room by then, close enough that Ren could run over in her socks when she wanted an audience for a cartwheel, far enough that June and I still had to actually choose each other every day, instead of just defaulting into it, which she said mattered to her, and which, once she explained why, mattered to me too. Some promises are loudest exactly because nobody ever says them out loud. I spent 15 years thinking the sentence I swallowed behind that gym had simply evaporated, gone the moment I chose 4 easier words instead. It hadn't. It had just been waiting inside a bedtime story about a water tower, told to a little girl over and over, until she got old enough to carry it across a gymnasium floor and hand it back to the one person who needed to hear it most. I was up on a ladder checking the last of the barn flashing on a Sunday in October when Ren hollered up that she'd told her whole kindergarten class she was bringing 2 people for career day instead of 1. Waffles the chicken had apparently been considered and rejected as the second guest. June, down in the yard sorting crates, called up without looking over that she hoped I owned a hard hat because career day audiences did not forgive boring answers. I told her I'd manage, and I meant it the way I meant everything I told her these days, all the way through. She'd said yes to me 3 weeks earlier, right there on that porch, with Ren as the only witness and my grandmother's ring sitting a little crooked on her finger because I'd guessed the size wrong and neither of us cared enough to fix it yet. Ren was still waiting at the bottom of the ladder when I climbed down, hands on her hips, gap-toothed and entirely serious in the way she gets when something actually matters to her. You have to tell